Hey everyone, how's it going? Welcome back to the channel. We have a lot to dive into today, and we start out in the province of Ontario, where a constitutional challenge brought forward by the Church of God in Aylmer and Trinity Bible Chapel in Waterloo has been dismissed by a Superior Court judge earlier this week. The church's lawyers argued that the gathering restrictions were overbroad, unreasonable, and arbitrary, and that they cannot be justified in a free and democratic society. The Superior Court Justice Renee Pomerantz granted that the restrictions infringed on religious freedom, but maintained that the measures were, quote, rationally connected to a pressing and substantial objective and were proportionate in their effect, end quote. In other words, they say, yeah, we took some of your freedoms, but it was worth it because it was for a good cause. And this is some dangerous stuff we're getting into right now, because pressing and substantial objective is a pretty loose terminology, and it's completely arbitrary also, because who decides that? If it's up to the government to decide, they can slap that label on anything and then use that as an excuse to infringe on religious freedoms or other rights granted in the Charter. Pomerantz went on to say that the objectives of the restrictions, quote, are amongst the most compelling imaginable, the protection of human life in the face of an unprecedented and unpredictable virus. So I have 2 points to raise here. Number one, the virus is not unprecedented. We have had worse pandemics and plagues sweep the nation and the world in past years. Black Plague, Spanish flu. Many of them were worse in mortality rate and in general severity of the disease, even in those that did not die. And the only thing unprecedented in this situation is the response of the world's governments. We have never seen authoritarian control like they're imposing right now over the course of this pandemic. Second, no objective is important enough to infringe upon our rights and freedoms, especially the freedom to worship God in your own way. Pomerantz continued making excuses about how church restrictions were less stringent than those for non-religious activities such as bars, sporting events, theaters, etc., and that the government couldn't fully accommodate religious freedom, as this would have meant, quote, turning a blind eye to the threat of severe health consequences for a large swath of the population. And this is the danger of saying that some things are serious enough that we should be willing to sacrifice our charter rights, because when public health takes precedence over freedoms of any kind, you can be sure that the government will expand what constitutes a public health emergency. Whatever they deem to be dangerous to your health, people will be willing to do almost anything to fight against, because people value their health above almost everything else. And there can be no balance. There's no scale here where you put public health on one side and freedoms on the other, because nothing can ever outweigh our freedoms. And we can't forget that. We can't let them put anything above the rights and freedoms granted to us, not only by the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, but by God, who has endowed them to every human being. Everyone has the right to worship God in their own way, intrinsically, and no one can take that away. There is some good news, however, in Ontario on the issue of mask mandates, particularly in schools. Ontario Premier Doug Ford, who I am not particularly fond of, has made at least one good decision recently, and that is to drop the mask mandates as of March 21st. However, several school boards are fighting to keep the COVID restrictions in place for an extended period of time. Perhaps they're asking for a few more weeks. And the head of Ontario's Science Advisory Table, Dr. Peter Juni, says that it's too soon to tell if ending the mask mandates is safe. And when asked if the decision to drop the mask is scientific or political, he replied, it is not supported by science right now because it's just too early. NDP leader Andrea Horwath added that the experts say just a couple more weeks of simple masking will get us to the finish line, so why would Doug Ford block that? And I'll give you the answer to that question. It's because it will always be too early. And they're never going to want this thing to end. The experts will always say it's too soon to tell if it's safe to take them off or not. They always want to extend it just a little bit more. Just a few more days, you can handle that much. And then it will be a few more days and a few more days, and they're just going to drag it on forever if we let them. So somewhere we have to draw a line and hold it with zero compromise. As the truckers say, hold the line, fight at your line in the sand, and don't give an inch, because We have to tell them, you don't get another month, you don't get 2 weeks, you don't get 2 days, we're done with this, and we're done now. Set a concrete end date and stick to it. And this is the position that Ford took, thankfully. And he said that the school boards are not medical experts, and they should follow the direction of the chief medical officer, who supports ending the restrictions. So that's good for the official, both the medical officer and Ford in Ontario. That's at least one good point in all of this. Unfortunately, the next story demonstrates why I'm not a fan of Ford. So he appears to be talking out both sides of his mouth right now. According to an anonymous source speaking to the Post-Millennial, Ford's office and the Ontario Ministry of Health are preparing for the return of masks sometime in the fall around November. This source says that, quote, "We are just in a temporary situation for the summer months until seasonal infections rise again. Infections are undoubtedly going to rise. Cold, flu, a new COVID variant, it's bound to happen. And when they do, the government will not want to be seen as doing nothing, so they are going to reimpose masking to stop the spread," end quote. So you see what they did there? In the middle of that, they dropped in the cold and flu. So they want to mask up for the cold. The common cold, that thing that went around every year for forever, and everybody got it, and some people coughed a little bit, had a runny nose, but we lived with it, and very few people died. Almost no one died, and the source comes right out and says that they want to mask up for that. And then they say something even worse. They say the quiet part out loud, quote, "Right now it's smart that we lift these restrictions because it's a great vote winner, but when winter rolls around, we're going to be back to square one." I hate this so much. They're admittedly doing this just to look good and stay in office when election season hits come June. And but as soon as they cement themselves in power again, they'll just bring it back. So Doug Ford needs to receive as much backlash to this as possible so that he abandons all COVID restrictions for the remainder of his time in office, however long that may be. The parents need to go to their school boards. There needs to be people speaking out about this all over the place, because we can't let this happen. They can't go back and forth. If you're going to be done, be done. The people are through with this, Doug, so listen to them. And speaking of listening to the people, here are some of the voices that really matter on this issue, the voices of the actual kids in these schools. CBC put out an article in which they compare the thoughts of 2 students from a school in Barrie, Ontario about taking off the mask. The first one on the anti-mask side is Charlotte Dodge, age 10. She's glad to see them go, saying, quote, "I had a very big smile on my face and I was very happy. Wearing masks makes it hard to breathe sometimes, so I was very excited," end quote. She added that masks are also itchy and hurt her ears, and that over the course of the pandemic she has never got used to wearing them. Finally, she says, "I always like my face better without a mask." Way to go, Charlotte. And on the other side of this issue is David Lee, age 11. He says, "Sometimes I have insecurities and it helps me feel confident about myself," end quote. And he also likes the feeling of anonymity, quote, "It just hides my face a bit, so then nobody else can see it, so then I can just feel more confident about myself, knowing that nobody will see my face." That is one of the most tragic things that I've read throughout this pandemic. What have they done to these kids? This kid, who obviously struggles already with insecurities about his appearance, has been kept from facing those fears and building confidence in the things he can't change during some of the most important years of his development. And rather than feeling confident and comfortable in who he is and learning to be himself in spite of what anybody thinks of him, the only way he can feel confident in public now is if he hides his face. Get that? An 11-year-old is afraid to show his face because that's the only way that he can feel any self-esteem or feel like people will like him. And he is undoubtedly not alone in this. The psychological damage that has been done to kids across Canada and around the world is massive and incalculable, and it is a shame to every government that supported these measures. I really hope that David can face his insecurities and someday feel comfortable with who he is and the things that he can't change. And the children are the real victims in all of this. So I really hope that we are somehow able to bounce back from this at least a little bit. One more story about the masks in schools. A very mask-focused show today. A teacher in Toronto, the name of Peter Hasek, has publicly endorsed mask-based segregation in classrooms. And this is going to be exactly what you would expect this guy to think and look like. He goes by he, they pronouns, and this is exactly how I was expecting him to look. Check this out. He's got the purple hair, the weird scruffy goatee, very creepy looking. He's got the earring. In a tweet earlier this week, he said, quote, "Teachers, some best practices for you to implement for March 21st. Classrooms with a segregated seating plan, students split into masked/unmasked sections, HEPA filters placed between the two, and parents who choose to mask their kids will appreciate your consideration. #maskwork." And this tweet thankfully met with significant backlash online, to the point that Hasek has now deleted his entire Twitter profile. And it's times like these when I actually love the internet. I love that there are still enough sane people that we can sniff out people like this and bring them down. And the outrage was strong enough that even the Toronto District School Board has jumped in the dog pile, saying, "We strongly disagree with this social media post. The opinion shared by this staff member does not reflect the position of the Toronto District School Board, and this will not be happening in any of our classrooms." End quote. The school board also said that Hasek will be put on home assignment pending the outcome of an investigation. So that's a good start, but just cut to the chase and fire him, because that's what needs to happen anyway. Because this kind of degenerate fanatic has no place being anywhere within 300 meters of a public school, much less inside teaching our kids. And we're not blowing smoke when we warn you about people like this, these radicals and crazies that have infiltrated the school system. And sometimes it just takes one that's a little bit less discreet to come right out and say it and make our point for us. So in that way, I would say thank you to Peter Hasek and good riddance. Moving on and a little bit back in time, we revisit some convoy news. So you remember a few episodes ago I told you about Tamara Litch, the Freedom Convoy organizer who was denied bail. Well, she has been released, but the question is she really free? After 18 days in jail, Miss Litch is on her way back to Alberta with several suspicious and dubious conditions. These are that she cannot protest, she cannot use social media, she cannot have anyone post anything on her behalf. So the answer is no, she is not free. Basically, the courts have told her you can go free, but only if you give up all your beliefs and values. She can be back in her home, but she can't be the Tamara Litch that existed 3 weeks ago. This is a real example of infringement on freedom of speech. She can think what she wants, although you'd have to be careful about that too, because you never know. But you can't say anything about it, and you for sure can't act on it. So as Jordan Peterson says, if you lose the freedom of speech, you lose freedom of life, because speech is the basis of how you act, and action makes up life. So this is just a further and much more disturbing precedent for the violation of Canadians' charter rights. And we need to fight this issue on every level, because there is no freedom unless there's total freedom. If you can't think and say what you want to say, given that it's true and does not violate any other moral obligations, then you really are not free. And how could I do an entire video and not mention the elephant in the room on the global stage, the Ukraine conflict? First, I need to explain why I haven't talked about it very much since the invasion. So for one thing, I am not afraid to admit that I'm not well educated enough to provide a meaningful and in-depth analysis of this situation. I have opinions just like everyone else, but I am working on learning more before I share any thoughts of my own with the world, because everyone doesn't have to be an overnight expert or jump on the bandwagon of standing with the current cause. Just as soon as a thing pops up, you don't have to know everything about it. You don't have to take a stance. Just wait until the dust kind of settles before you pass in judgment on it, because there's a lot that you don't know, and you need to be willing to admit that. And another reason that I haven't spoke about this issue is that I'm always suspicious of any cause that everybody is lining up and clamoring to support all at once. All the media have jumped on this, all left-wing politicians, anything that everybody unites on is usually, not always, but usually not a great cause to get behind. So I'm going to wait and see how it shakes down, because Ukraine it's not as black and white as some people think it is. Everything about Ukraine is not good. Everything about Russia is not bad. And another issue is that it's dangerous when networks and platforms drop everything to cover this one issue. Like CBC, CNN, CTV, all other big names have nothing but Russia, Ukraine on their front pages. And it's understandable that it receives more coverage. I'm fine with that. But not to the exclusion of literally everything else. COVID is gone. Convoy news is gone. And everything that we were discussing 2 weeks ago has been erased in favor of covering a European conflict. And I'm not saying, I'm not going to the extent that they engineered this to distract from anything else, but it is convenient for them, just as COVID stuff is starting to get some pushback and winding down, and these convoys are popping up, which they're still going on, but they've conveniently chosen not to cover that and instead dedicated all their attention to Ukraine. And that's why I try to bring you a variety of topics with every show, so you don't just hear what you're hearing everywhere else, and you also get a balanced view, because there is obviously more than one thing going on in the world at a time. So here are a few stories that I do want to address concerning the Russia-Ukraine conflict, but both of them take place outside of continental Europe. More of reactions to the conflict than stories about the conflict itself. First, the Cardiff Philharmonic Orchestra in Wales announced that they will be pulling Tchaikovsky's music from their March 18th concert due to the invasion, because they feel that the previously advertised program, including the 1812 overture, to be inappropriate at this time. Excuse me, what? So because Russia invaded Ukraine, you're going to stop playing the music of one of the great classical composers of the century? How does this accomplish anything? This is a level of hysteria that we didn't even see following 9/11. As many people have pointed out, everybody was making sure that we don't engage in Islamophobia. Don't blame all Muslims because some Islamic terrorists blew up the towers. Well, some Russians invaded Ukraine. They don't all want to be there. The people in Russia don't support it. So why are we jumping into this thing like everything Russian is bad? How does stopping playing Tchaikovsky accomplish anything at all? Does that somehow hurt the Russians because you're not playing the compositions of a man who died in 1893? I'm sure that will put a dent in the fighting spirit. Oh no, the Cardiff Philharmonic isn't playing Tchaikovsky's classical anymore. I guess we better head back home. We can't do without that. This could be called, I guess, Russophobia. Anything Russian bad, anything Ukrainian good. And as I said, it's not as clear-cut as all that. And this just shows how absurdly uneducated people are about this whole thing. Everybody is making statements, everybody's virtue signaling, and nothing is actually about having an effect. And following that same vein, I will wrap up today's show with one pathetically stupid but hilarious story out of Quebec. So, as all of you Canadians know, we have a dish up here in the north made with fries, gravy, and cheese curds called, you guessed it, poutine. Poutine, if you want to be technical. Well, you probably know where this is going. I'll just read you the headline. Quebec diner drops the word poutine over dish sharing name with Russian president. I don't even know where to start with this. Since the Russian invasion, a Quebec restaurant called Le Roi Giuseppe has temporarily stopped serving this dish because its name looks and sounds similar to President Vladimir Putin's name when written or said in French. Le Roi Giuseppe's Facebook page, I'm not making this up, you could slap Babylon Bee on this and I would have believed it, but I've seen it with my own eyes. Check out the Facebook page. They previously read, inventor of poutine, now says in French, l'inventeur de la frite fromage sauce, translated, inventor a fries, cheese, gravy. Somebody knock me out, please. I have heard very few things more ridiculous in the recent news cycle. Is there anyone that actually thinks that a menu item with a French name of a classic Canadian dish, including fries, cheese, and gravy, somehow correlates to support for the Russian president with a similar name? Like, if you serve this dish on the menu, I'm sure that makes you a pro-Russian sympathizer, and you support the civilian killings of Ukrainians. Yeah, by buying a poutine, yeah, for sure. Is there anybody out here that actually believes that? If you exist, please don't tell me. If you know anybody that exists, and I find out, I will laugh you to scorn, and then I will publicly shame you in front of the entire internet because you are just ridiculous. Go outside, touch some grass if you can, snow if you can't, and pick up a book while you're at it, and educate yourself a bit, and maybe grab a poutine. Won't hurt you, and it won't do anything to aid the Russian offensive. So with that, we reached the end of today's video. Like and subscribe, hit the bell, and if you see anything interesting this week, as far as news stories, tag me. I need material to cover, and it's nice to have some ahead of time. And I will see you all here next week.